Okay. Alright, so I can't see any comments or anything because the phone is too far away to be able to see what's going on. But I just, yesterday I did my first part of this series. I've been reading a novella from Cory Doctorow's collection of stories, Radicalized. And the one that I've been reading is called The Masque of the Red Death. And basically the core concept for the story is, an elitist douchebag who is stupidly rich and has the DNA of a prepper, built himself a fabulously ludicrous Fort Doom that he could use to hide out from the apocalypse, which he stylizes as the event. And he put together a guest list of 30 people that he thought were cool, half of whom were meant to be women, attractive women, because that's usually how that type rolls. And we left off after the first challenge to his authority. He had offered one of the people he had met at a gym an opportunity to join him at Fort Doom to ride out the apocalypse. And then that person showed up with their family. And that was super against the rules. And Martin had to decide whether or not he wanted to kill him. He didn't, but he felt pretty bad about it. And that's sort of where we left off. The idea for the reading is really just I know that things have been extremely stressful for everybody. They certainly have for me. My anxiety's been at 10 for days and days and days. And I found that the times at which it was at its lowest have been when I've been doing something creative or diverting. And an old tradition for me when I feel like I can't sleep at night because of anxiety is I'll get up and get out of the bed and go somewhere else and read, sort of a change of venue and force my brain to contemplate other things. And so I thought I would share that with you guys. If you're into it, great. There's no test at the end. If you guys want to talk about the story at some point, feel free to hit me up on Facebook or whatever. But the idea is to just have something in the background to listen to as you think about winding down and drifting off to sleep. So I certainly wouldn't take it as an insult if halfway through any of these reading sessions you turn it off to go to bed. That's the goal. So Shara Valentine mentioned last time that I needed a drink and a pipe. I had a pipe handy. I thought about doing a drink as well, but then I wouldn't be able to hold the book and mug with the pipe at the same time. So I'm gonna hold the pipe while I do it. I don't care. I love it. The pipe is a great prop. It's awesome, and it makes me feel very I don't know, like I should have a smoking jacket on, and this should be like a leather bound library behind me. But you've got Joe Bob and Millicent Patrick designing the Creature from the Black Lagoon. So shout out to Travis Knight who made this art. All right, so Cory Doctorow, Radicalized, The Masque of the Red Death. If you missed out last night, the cover says, Martin's a smart guy. He knows the big collapse is coming. He spent years creating his hidden desert retreat, the one stocked with enough food, guns, and antibiotics for Martin and a bunch of his invited friends. These are the men and women, well, Martin hopes some of them will be women, who intend to ride out the coming catastrophe and emerge to pick up the pieces. Because they're the smart ones. Nothing about their plan could possibly go wrong. Everything goes wrong. And that's where we're about to pick up, I think, is Martin is about to face some pretty serious challenges. And we're going to find out if he is every bit the alpha that he claims to be and perfectly capable in every way. All right. So if this sounds like a good time for you, settle in and I'll start reading. It was a month later, and there'd been a little bit of news on the shortwave, a mix of BBC World Service, RT, and apocalyptic apostate Mormon preachers with high wattage transmitters on the Arizona Strip shouting about the White House prophecy. They'd been drinking well water to conserve the bottled supplies, boiling it just in case, and their diet was half MRE, half elk and deer sniped from the towers. There were 23 of them now, and they had a good little routine of divvying up the cleaning and cooking and hunting and such. There wasn't all that much to do. So they played epic chess matches and had movie marathons, and some of them paired off and snuck away for outdoor sex or commandeered one of the bedrooms and hung a handkerchief on the doorknob. There was always at least one person staffing the CCTV feeds looking for intruders, and a few times they'd all rushed back and buttoned up when convoys or lone cars had gone by. It was lonely territory, and there wasn't much of that. A few times, Martin had caught members of the 23 going outside without their mandatory walkie-talkies, and he'd torn strips out of them, impressing on them that while things were calm and peaceful out at Fort Doom, there was still plenty of mayhem and murder out there in the world, and they were putting everyone at risk by getting out of contact. If intruders came down the road and Martin had no way to call everybody in, someone might get spotted, and that might bring back a full force of bad guys. Blood and death would follow. The Jeep came back up the trail and rang every bell in the fort as it climbed closer and closer. It was the first time a vehicle had come that close to the fort since the last stragglers had arrived. When Martin recognized the Jeep, his heart started to hammer in his chest. This was it. The invasion he'd been dreading. The consequences of his foolish sentimentality come back to end all their lives. He sent his 2 best shots. One of them was a woman, which he discovered when they organized a day's shooting competition up into the sniper towers, and went to the vestibule. The Jeep was not in good shape. It had a big, ugly dent running down the passenger side, like it had been T-boned, and the windshield was starred with cracks. The exhaust pipe belched dark, ugly smoke. The Jeep pulled up in the parking area and sat motionless for a long time. As Martin's nerves stretched tighter and tighter, he almost gave the order to fill it with bullets. Then the driver door opened and Albert's aunt stepped out. She didn't look good either. Sick, maybe, and certainly moving slow. She was wearing a fleece jacket and jeans and heavy boots that flopped on her feet, so big on her that he could see they didn't fit from 100 yards. He held his breath while he waited for the other car doors to open, but they didn't. The woman stepped around the Jeep and stopped, resting her hand on the hood and breathing and staring at the vestibule. She took a deep breath and drew herself up and walked towards them, limping a little, boots flapping. "Stop there," Martin said, cranking the gain on the vestibule speakers, loud enough to be heard on the front lawn. She stopped and swayed slightly, staring around, and then started walking again. "Stop," Martin said. She pushed forward. Her hair was coming loose from its ponytail. Her face was sheened with sweat and lined with exhaustion. She put a hand to her stomach and groaned. "Stop," Martin said, and played his MP3 of a cocking rifle. She stared into the darkness of the vestibule with mournful eyes, and then she staggered in. Martin did not have it in him to shoot a sick, injured, middle-aged lady. Partly that was basic human decency. Martin was not a bad person, he knew that. And partly it was the fully rational calculus of maintaining his moral authority in Fort Doom. "What do you want?" "Albert died," she said. "There's so much sickness. It took him, then my boys." Her face was hollow and flat. "They say it's cholera." She squeezed her face into a grief mask. "So many people are sick." Martin felt his own guts clench. His own bowels turned to water. He had Cipro and other broad-spectrum last-resort antibiotics, but he hadn't replaced them yet this year, and a bunch of them were expiring soon. He read that their efficacy would start to fall off a cliff when that happened. After a deliberate bioweapon attack, cholera was one of the fears that kept him up at night. He had lots of guns, but you can't shoot germs. "Yeah. If you're sick, you'll have to leave." He made his voice hard. She stared into the vestibule's camera. Clutching her gut, trembling, sheened with sweat. He'd need to break out a bunny suit and bleach solution and power wash the whole thing. She wasn't moving. "Go," he said. She stared on, nearly doubled over now, chin raised, still staring, or glaring, maybe. Martin didn't let himself feel empathy for her. It was the grasshopper and the ants. He'd done all the work to make himself a cozy shelter from the blowing winter, and she had done whatever she'd done instead. Made a bunch of babies, watched reality TV, taken drugs, or crocheted. People who didn't think ahead were self-correcting problems. She was correcting herself, and it wasn't pretty, but it wasn't his problem either. Her chin trembled. She was holding back tears. "Please," she said in a tiny voice that barely reached the mic. There was motion behind him, people drifting into the hospitality suite, watching the interaction, watching him. This was a leadership test, a moment of truth. He could shoot her dead where she stood. The additional fluids probably would not pose any extra hazard. He was going to need to power wash and bleach no matter what. Would his people see that as a show of strength or a show of weakness? "If you come back in an hour, I'll leave you some supplies down at the trailhead. We don't have much, but I can give you some food, some Tylenol, warm blankets, but I can't let a sick person in here. This isn't a hospital. You bring sickness in here, we could all get it. We could all die." The last word snapped her head back, like he'd fired a bullet between her eyes. Those eyes, the eyes of a dead woman who knew it. Slowly, she straightened up. She took a step backward, hands still pressed to her stomach like she was gut-shot. She backed out of the vestibule and then turned and walked in slow, careful, pained steps to her car. She managed to get past the bumper before a cramp doubled her over. He saw her knuckles go white on the car's hood as she struggled to stay upright. Then she straightened again and got in her wreck of a car, driving off slowly. He waited until she was out of sight of the highest cameras. Then he took a couple of deep breaths, put away the gun he'd had lined up with the shooting slit in the vestibule door, and stepped back into the hospitality suite with a carefully composed look of concern and confidence on his face. "What a disaster. I really feel for her," he said, making a point of meeting the eyes of Lloyd, the physically strongest of the men in the fort, then Saleha, the oldest person, then Georgia, the hottest woman, who all constituted a kind of power center in Fort Doom. Georgia said, "I don't think I could have done that, Martin." He couldn't tell if it was admiration or recrimination. "It was hard," he said, "but I'll round up as many supplies as we can spare. I wish there was more we could do, but sickness in here," he made a pained and disgusted face. "It would be ugly. Our safety has to come first. She'll have to figure out her own destiny." Saleha said, "It's a waste of supply. She's not going to make it. All you'll be doing is encouraging dependence. If she lives, she'll be back for more. I guarantee it." Martin privately agreed and made a mental note of who nodded along and who looked like they thought Saleha was a monster for saying it. "I won't give her anything we can't afford. But it's the right thing to do." Then he made a show of breaking out a bunny suit from under one of the benches and fitting the mask and eye protectors, and then lugging out the power washer. It was the right thing to do. But it was also a very showily correct thing to do, the kind of thing a competent leader would do to keep his people safe. He stuffed the bunny suit into a hazmat burn bag, packed a tub of food. He thought about putting eye drops in the jug of water, which would see off Albert's aunt, but in the end, he couldn't bring himself to be a poisoner. It was the most cowardly of all the ways to kill, and drove it down to the trailhead in an ATV. He had Lloyd cover him with a rifle from one of the towers and kept his walkie on the whole way. The next morning, the tub was gone. 1 week went by. 2, 3. The shortwave was full of news, all of it contradictory and impossible to understand. There was a provisional Arizona Republic, but if it was real and not just some shit kickers with a transmitter, then it was a mess. This pipe is great. The guy who styled himself the Secretary of Communications for the Republic made Alex Jones sound calm and coherent, and he ranted for 16-hour stretches that had to be amphetamine-fueled. They certainly sounded that way. Martin had appointed Gene to serve as quartermaster. Gene was a young man without much ambition. He'd been a junior trader and going nowhere, but he was easy to manipulate and sucked at line, and Martin valued both of those traits. In his experience, they made for the very highest caliber of flunky. He wasn't going to dip into the supplies, and if he did, he'd out himself by turning it into a stammering mess at the first hint of an accusation. Gene made color-coordinated spreadsheets showing their rate of consumption of all their supplies, with excellent bar and pie charts for easy reference. The upshot was they could eat off their stores for another 2 months if need be, but it would involve rationing and a lot of dinners of dried meat and vitamin pills and fiber supplements to keep everything moving. No one wanted that. And besides, everyone was bored shitless and starting to click up and hook up and break up and generally go stir crazy. So Martin decreed they would hunt and scavenge for supplies to stretch out their stores, aiming for a minimum of 50% of all consumables coming from outside the fort. They'd hunt game, of course. Lloyd could dress a steer or a deer, and the rest of them were learning. And Georgia was an excellent cook who made everything from cowboy steaks to liver to Gene from the animals they brought down. The scavenging parties were a new one. The fort was very remote, but Martin had mapped out all the nearby settlements, a couple of ranches, a gas station with an attached country store, a Nevada Highway Patrol substation. The scavengers took out the electric ATVs in silent mode by moonlight, dressed in charcoal gray with their faces blacked and their hands in black gloves, and scouted them with night vision scopes before approaching the empty ones. The gas station, two of the ranches. The gas station had been trashed and looted, and someone had tried to blow up its storage tanks, but their fire suppression systems had kicked in, leaving every surface slimed with cancerous residue. But the ranches yielded all kinds of loot. Canned goods, root cellars worth of vegetables, blankets, outfits they played dress-up in, ancient board games, a box of card decks, and an inlaid carousel of poker chips, photo albums that they pored over and laughed at and speculated on. That killed another week. And in 3 days, they were 100% reliant on external sources for food. Admittedly, a lot of that came from the ranches, a non-renewable resource, but as Andreas pointed out, if the shit continued to hit the fan, there'd be a lot fewer people, and that meant a lot more elk and such. Andreas also had some things to say about the kinds of delicacies that could be prepared from edible cactus, and ideas about how to figure out which cacti qualified. There were more ranches farther away, and even a little town with a Navajo gift shop and a gun store. Martin figured that if they put together a raiding party and outfitted one of the empty ranches as a base of operations, they could make incursions into these more distant targets without risking the ATV's power cells, or straying so far from the fort that they couldn't retreat to it if someone needed emergency medical care. There wasn't any good reason to go for the gun store, but everyone was excited at the prospect. Living through the visit from Albert's aunt and then witnessing the ruins of the general store and gas station had convinced them that they were smarter and better than the idiots out in the world who hadn't made the same kinds of preparation. When they tried to imagine what they'd do if they were stuck out there in the world while a group of smarter people were cozy in Fort Doom, it was easy to imagine a marauding force trying to take the fort. The guns might come in handy. And besides, if they didn't get them, someone else would, and then the guns might end up pointed at the fort. When you thought about it that way, it was practically a moral imperative. They used drones to scout the run, doing several flyovers, and then a couple of low flybys to get a sense of who might be in the area. They spotted some Mexicans outside of a neatly kept house, tending a garden, and pointing with alarm at the drone as it buzzed them. But apart from them, nothing. Martin had chosen a truly remote place for his fort, remote even by Arizona standards, where there was so much big sky and big country that you could go off the beaten path and see no one at all for days. Of course, if they traveled not much farther in the opposite direction, they'd be at the outskirts of Phoenix Metro, and God knew what kinds of chaos they'd find there. All the more reason to get the guns. Planning the gun rally was incredibly fun. Martin turned the hospitality suite into a war room, brought in a big whiteboard, tacked up aerial photos from the drones. They started calling the ranch Forward Base Alpha, which was really cool to say. Getting close enough to the gun store, Big Tom's, as it was called, to check out its condition in detail was hard. The drones had a range of just over a click, and the terrain around Big Tom's was flat with only a little low scrub, so there wasn't anywhere to shelter while the recon teams piloted the drones in. They just had to hope that they find it untouched, ready to be cracked open with Fort Doom's oxyacetylene cutting torch. Allen and Crispin were drafted to operate a cargo vehicle, Martin's armored pickup, to carry away the loot once the place was sprung. Martin called the mission for a Monday. They'd used a big paper calendar hung prominently in the hospitality suite to track the procession of days and nights. And the night before, they barbecued steaks and drank some of his very best old bourbon, including a bottle of 20-year-old Pappy that Gene had carefully noted in his quartermaster spreadsheet. There was enough for 3 glasses each, and Martin couldn't help but brag that each of those little shot glasses held $100 worth of liquor at pre-collapse prices. Who knew what it would fetch in the marketplaces of the New World when it emerged? He entertained a brief fantasy of presiding over a market stall in some fair town, surrounded by mercenaries with hair triggers dickering over trade goods with princelings of the nearby fortresses. It was ridiculous Frazetta stuff, but it was a hard image to shake. The mission was a catastrophe. Brett didn't come back. He'd been on point when they scurried under cover of darkness to Big Tom's, wearing night scopes. His backups, Alan and Crispin, had circled wide and were coming in from the other side, waiting for Brett to make his entry. Crispin didn't make it either. Alan was the one who told the story, shaking and crying. The footage from his GoPro was shit, even with the night filters on, an uninterpretable, blurry cam jumble. Brett had crept to within 100 yards and then crawled, then belly crawled, inching through the parking lot of Big Tom's, trying to keep the few cars between him and the store, moving slowly and smoothly. Alan kept his rifle trained on the front door. Crispin moved in a rotation between several targets, windows, the roof, a blind corner. Every time he moved his scope, he whispered, "Clear," into the walkie he was wearing. "Am I go?" Brett asked. He was breathing heavily. "Go," Crispin said. "Go," Alan said. Brett got up in a runner's crouch and sprinted to the door. He flattened himself against the wall. They heard his breath rasping through the walkie earpieces. Alan wished he could be there with Brett. This was so fucking cool. They saw a small red light go on and pan over the door, and then it winked out. Locked. Good lock, too. Steel plating. Okay, going to knock. He rapped at the door. They debated this, but on balance they decided it was for the best. If there was someone inside, better to make contact this way than to come on them by surprise. It was a gun store, after all. He thumped. "Hello? Anyone home?" They all held their breath. Brett's breath rasped in. "Okay." A distant sound of Velcro as he unholstered the Makita drill from his thigh and twisted in the high-speed steel bit. They saw the pinprick of light from the drill as he worked the trigger while holding the chuck to tighten on the bit. Then he crouched and fitted the bit in the lock's keyway. They heard the distant whine of the drill, slightly out of phase with the walkie's staticky transmission. "Come on, you little bastard," Brett whispered. And then, shit. He stopped the drill. Sound of the broken bit falling to the ground, fumbling with a replacement, and then the whir of the drill started again. All the way through, switching to a bigger bit. The sounds of the chuck working, clink of the bits, rasp of Brett's breath, sound of Crispin chanting, "Clear, clear, clear," as he moved his rifle around. "Okay," Brett said. Just as blinding lights went on all around the building. Crispin squeezed off a shot reflexively, Alan thought, and then there were 2 more shots, and Brett pitched forward. Through his scope, Alan saw the smoke rising out of the bullet hole in the door, and for an instant, he saw the frayed edges of the thin metal that had been used to cover the firing slit. More shots and puffs of smoke rising from the parking lot. One of the broken-down SUVs lost its windshield in a shatter of glass cubes that glittered in the incredible light. "Brett! Brett!" Alan said. The blood oozing from around him was unmistakable, and Alan felt a sudden dose of cold grue as he realized how exposed he was. He was about to get up and scramble back when trapdoors on the roof of the gun store flopped back in unison, and 4 sharpshooters popped out, laying down suppressing fire as they got into position behind brick bluffs on the roof's corners. They wore shooting glasses and all tactical, faces grim but mouths open and wide grins, inaudible war cries as they fired into the night. He heard Crispin die over the walkie. A meaty sound, a shout, 2 more, a gasp, then nothing. There was stickiness all over Alan's legs. He'd pissed himself. This was idiotic. A misunderstanding. They didn't want to fight. There was nothing to fight over. Fort Doom had lots of guns already, more than they could ever fire. This was a break from the tedium, a game. He moaned. Had they spotted him? The sharpshooters were scanning the terrain slowly and methodically. He wanted to call out to them to surrender, but he knew he'd be executed on the spot. He understood that this is exactly what they'd have done in Fort Doom if someone had shown up there, armed, drilling out the locks covered by backup. He was going to die. Alan had been a very successful property developer who had started off flipping distressed homes. Then he'd made connections with the city planner's office and started getting inside dope on which places would face the least resistance if he wanted to tear them down and build high-rises. And he'd hustled up some movie and started buying houses for cash. 2 or 3 in a row, on big old lots, family places going back generations. He'd specialized in having them demoed before anyone knew that anything was up, dozing them to the foundation slabs all on the same day, in and out before the noise complaints could be followed up on. He called his boys the wrecking crew and paid top dollar if they could finish by sunset. The condos he put up paid for it all, mid-rises, then high-rises, then complexes. He understood the power of unrelenting speed. Sometimes he pictured himself as a shark, never stopping, surging forward to snap up prey, moving from debt to payment to debt to payment, creaming off the profit. He was not feeling like a shark anymore. He tried to be a snail, a slug, low-lying, slow-moving, so slow you'd never see him. He put his face in the coarse, cool nighttime sand, making himself as flat as he could be. Using his fingertips and the tips of his booted toes, he edged himself half an inch backwards, toward the trike he'd left parked 20 yards away. No one shot him. In his earpiece, he heard the sound from Brett's walkie, faint conversation from the sharpshooters, 1 word in 3. Got him, see him, good shot, motherfucker. Another half inch, holding his breath, then breathing shallowly. A slug, a snail, another half inch. Another, count to 10. Another. Scrape of the door to Big Tom's opening. Bang as it hits Brett's corpse. Slow slide and grunt as someone pushed the door and Brett's body along with it. Fucking assholes from the walkie. Boots on concrete. Scuffle of the walkie being handled. Hey, any of you assholes out there hear me? Alan held his breath, stole his hand to the walkie on his belt, and felt blindly for the mute button. Was that it? He was dying to breathe, and it would definitely come out as a gasp. A snail. A slug. He pressed the button. A soft click. Hello? I bet these sons of bitches have backup out there. Greg, you see anyone? Muffled reply. Yeah, okay. Scuffle. Lizzie, kill the lights, would you? Night scopes are useless with them on. Let's see what we got out there. His blood went cold. The piss coating his legs turned to ice. Fuck. He inched faster. Faster. Conversation in the walkie earpiece, incomprehensible over the rasp of his clothes, the rasp of his breath. Faster. Click. The lights went off. Green blobs danced in front of his eyes. Despite the long moments they'd been pressed into the dirt, he leaped to his feet and ran, sprinting for the place he thought he'd left the trike, not able to see, stumbling. And there was shouting behind him, a rifle shot, 2 more. He fell to the ground, sobbing but not hit. Up again, trying to zigzag, his pants stuck to his legs by piss, refusing to cooperate, and then he smashed face first into the trike's roll bar, stars in his vision. He tumbled into the trike, flattening himself on the floorboard. A shot went into the trike's body. Another ricocheted off into the desert. Flecks of dust rained down on him. The keys were in the ignition, and he left it pointing out part of the careful planning that had been so much fun to do on the whiteboard. He turned the key, bent double over the trike, head down, awkward foot on the accelerator, and the electric brush motor engaged, and the trike rocketed forward, nearly throwing him clear, knocking his foot free of the accelerator, and the trike stopped suddenly, throwing him clear again, nearly. He scrambled into the seat. A bullet hole appeared in the windshield ahead of him, which starred. He closed his eyes and whimpered, even as he planted his ass firmly in the seat, sitting higher, head exposed, hands on the wheel, foot back on the accelerator. And this time he was braced for the acceleration, and the trike leaped forward, and he opened his eyes and flipped on the headlights because he had to see where he was going, and they had night scopes. And he swerved back and forth, trying to make the movement random and unpredictable, in large part succeeding because he was too shaken to steer in any fashion save erratically. More shots puffed into the dirt around him, one close enough to spray him with hard bits of gravel that cut open his cheek. As the walkie faded out of range, he heard them hooting and swearing. He drove and drove and drove, stopping on a deserted stretch of road with good sight lines in all directions, where he vomited until there was nothing more to come up except mucousy spit. He had a cooler on the passenger seat, and he opened and drained a can of Coke, ate 20 milligrams of Adderall, and then fired up the bike again. He drove to Forward Base Alpha first, and opened the padlock they'd fitted to the door with shaking hands, walking around the familiar ranch house with its shelves of supplies and stack of paperbacks and board games, as well as the overnight bag he'd packed, and gave him a sense of absolute unreality. Only a few hours before he'd been here with Brett and Crispin, laughing, going over the plans, trembling with excitement. Now he was trembling with terror in the room, bleeding, lightheaded, empty-stomached but nauseated all the same, vision out of focus, and legs chapped with his own piss. He dropped his pants on the floor and pulled handfuls of baby wipes out of a container and scrubbed at his legs and ass and balls, tossing the dirty wipes on the floor. He upended his overnight bag and found a spare pair of pants and pulled them on, then transferred the contents of his dirty pants pockets. He changed shirts. He got his trike keys. He looked around the room. There was food. He should take food. A handful of pepperoni sticks, a box of energy bars, a 6-pack of Gatorade. The Adderall sang in his veins, made him feel like the first time he drunk a cup of coffee, like superpowers were on their way. He had a crazy, nearly irresistible urge to torch the ranch house, something about it haunted by the ghosts of the men who died that night, full of evidence of their idiocy. He could do it. They'd moved some gas supplies into the ranch to run the backup Jenny for when the solar cells didn't top up the batteries. Splish splosh, one match. Woomph. It would send up a plume of smoke for miles around, though. If the sharpshooters from Big Tom's were driving through the night looking for him, they'd see it, and the ranch was halfway to Fort Doom. He wouldn't burn it down then. He got on the trike and drove. The surviving residents of Fort Doom watched Alan shiver and weep as he told his story, and Martin watched them watching Alan, trying to control his rage. The fucking ineptitude and the panic. Alan had driven back to Fort Doom not knowing whether he was followed, whether there was a drone overhead or cars on his tail. The Big Tom's gang had been organized, ruthless, and of course fantastically well armed. Martin could button up the fort and snipe at them from his towers, but what if they had heavy arms, grenade launchers, missiles, the kind of thing that an army might bring to a battlefield? The odds were against it. Probably they had high-fived, buried the bodies, and celebrated with a big pancake breakfast. But what if they hadn't? One thing Martin had learned as a trader, small risks with huge downsides couldn't be ignored. So he waited until Alan had told his story and everyone had commiserated and said kind words about Crispin and Brett, and then he took Alan back into his room for a drink. Alan looked small and beaten, huddled on one of the armchairs in Martin's room. Martin poured him an above-average single malt on a big whiskey rock, the kind of thing that Alan used to celebrate his business triumphs with. Alan had had a lot of those, and they'd enjoyed plenty of boozy nights in some of the nicer bars in Phoenix together. There had even been a fishing trip together in Bermuda, with deadly blender drinks the bartender called Zack Attacks. The bartender was named Zach. Nice kid. Yale dropout. "Are you going to be okay?" He forced concern into his tone. Alan drank. I guess so. I mean, yeah, sure, people have gotten over worse. Plenty of people, especially these days. Martin took a drink, watched him. He hadn't figured that Alan would fold up like this. Panic? Lose his shit? Really? Well, that's good, because you need to do something. What's that? He reached for the bottle and refilled his glass. The whiskey rolled over the big cube. He rattled it against the edges of the heavy lowball glass. You need to make this right. A puzzled look. Martin could see that the adrenaline and Adderall were wearing off. His eyelids were drooping, shoulders slumping deeper. You need to go back and make sure you didn't leave a trail. What? You heard me, Alan. They follow you here. It'll be all the shit you went through times 1,000. War, maybe. You fucked this up. Martin raised his voice. He had the only soundproofed room in the fort. Shut the fuck up, Alan. You fucked up, asshole. You panicked. Jesus fucking Christ. Don't you remember all those conversations we had about not carrying anything that could lead back to here or forward base alpha in case you dropped something or were captured or killed? Remember that, Alan? What was the point of all that if you were going to fucking run like a rabbit, leaving God knows what signs pointing here? What was the point, Alan, if you were going to endanger every single one of us with your panic, your recklessness, your cowardice, Alan? Alan withered under the words. Martin pressed him. Well, Alan, what the fuck have you got to say for yourself? Alan's red eyes swam with tears. Martin, I'm sorry. Well, that's just great. We'll put that on our fucking tombstones. Alan is sorry. What do you want from me, Martin? Get out there and make it right, you dumb fuck. Go and backtrack your trail carefully. Eliminate any sign you left behind you. Walk it if you have to. Every crossroad, and at least a mile on either side. Bring a room, bring a rake, whatever it takes. Take care of it. I haven't slept in. Martin rattled a bottle of Adderall in front of him. 30 milligrams should do it. You can sleep when you're done. Bring a bedroll and a pop-up tent, one of those little one-man shift pods. Don't fuck it up. Alan dry swallowed the round blue pill and heaved himself to his feet. Felix helped him pack, bringing him to the storeroom and rousing Jean to play quartermaster, barking out a supply list at Jean and having Jean load it into one of the intact ATVs along with a spare battery for the trike. He saw Alan off on his own via the big cargo door on the other side of the hill, moving the camouflage out of the way first. Go, he said. Come back with your shield. We're on it. It was nearly dawn when they heard the shot. Martin rushed to the monitors, reviewed the footage. It showed Alan's trike laboring up the hill to the front door, then Alan pacing for a while, then sitting in the trike's driver's seat for a longer while, contemplating the emptiness and the desert and the night. Then without any wind-up or hesitation, Alan drew his sidearm and put the barrel in his mouth, and pop. That was the shot. Martin waited until dawn, and then he got the power washer and went outside to clean up. Later that day, he took out the trike Alan had been on. His tracks were obvious. He'd ridden down to the bottom of the hill, done a wide circle leading out to the highway, then turned around and came back. He never even tried to erase his trail. Martin walked into Fort Doom, told them he was going to go and check Alan's trail for signs pointing home. He still had all of Alan's supplies. It turned out Alan hadn't been all that obvious on his way home. Or maybe Martin wasn't good at reading the signs. Either way, he found nothing between Fort and Forward Base Alpha, and then he crept slowly and cautiously from Forward Base Alpha to Big Tom's, and finding no sign, went back to Fort Doom, arriving after sunset, tired and sore. No one but Jean had seen any part of Martin and Alan's private discussion the night before, and Jean wouldn't talk. Martin made somber noises about trauma and bravery and sacrifice, and the need for all of them to know that they could always talk to him, to any of them, really, because they were all in this together. They were a unit now, a family, really, and they all had a duty to one another. He used the excavator to trench out a shallow grave for Alan and then filled it in. He didn't mark the grave, and when Georgia asked him about it, he told her it was to keep from giving any sign that there was any inhabitation near Fort Doom, and she nodded seriously and gave him a look of admiration that he called to mind that night as he lay himself down to sleep. Boredom was unquestionably the worst part of the end of the world. Out there in the world, things were anything but boring to judge from the shortwave broadcasts. The Provisional Republic of Arizona seemed to have gone off the air, but the CBs picked up scouting parties, and there were hams who'd crackle into life now and again, telling tales of military occupation and plagues in far-flung cities, wars, and aerial bombing campaigns. There was a National Guard station in Provo that sent out a daily admonition for refugees to stay the fuck out of Utah. And there were so many preachers. Sin, 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 redemption, redemption, redemption. One of them claimed consistently that New York City had been nuked until the rubble bounced. But that didn't feature on anyone else's communications, so the people of Fort Doom concluded that he was full of shit. This offended their sensibilities. A couple of them had grown up in New York, and most of them had worked for funds or banks with New York offices that demanded their presence every now and again. with late nights of expensive sushi and priceless whiskey. No one had any appetite for more missions, and after a brief deliberation, they decided that they would decommission Forward Base Alpha. Clearing out the ranch and bringing everything useful back to Fort Doom occupied a couple weeks, but then it was done, and Gene had inventoried it, and there was nothing else to do. They'd formed several different kinds of couples, and even a triple or two, and between the thin walls and the claustrophobic gossip, everyone had a pretty good idea of what it would be like to fuck everybody else. They'd all been sentenced to solitary confinement in each other's company. Izzy had been an English major, and he made them all watch a video he'd brought on his laptop, a Broadway production of No Exit. And they all laughed at hell as other people, and then Izzy made a cross-stitch that said that and framed it and hung it in the hospitality suite. And that's when Martin decided he needed to step in. We're going to have to start scavenging again. I know it's dangerous, but we've learned some hard lessons about being cautious. The good news is we don't have to hurry. We're not desperate yet. We find a place we want to check out, we can afford to watch it for days, even a week. Make sure it's safe before we move. That's the luxury we have because the cupboard isn't bare. But if we let the cupboard get bare, we lose that buffer. We'll have to rush into whatever situation we find or start to go hungry. That's way more dangerous than going out now. The only thing worse than suffering the tragedy of losing Crispin and Alan and Brett would be for their deaths to be in vain and for us to learn nothing from them. No one liked the idea, but everyone agreed that he was right. Martin's meticulous maps had plenty of possible scouting locations, further afield than the ranch houses. They had good luck with a family farm. It was inhabited, but the people there were willing to trade eggs and cheese for gemstones. Martin loved that. He had a lot of gemstones stockpiled, and in the wee hours of the night he wondered if he was kidding himself about whether anyone would want them. You can't eat gems, and converting them to useful goods required something like a functioning civilization. The fact that these stoic Latino farmers were willing to take a little bag of rubies and sapphires for 5 big wheels of cheese and a promise of 4 dozen eggs per week for the next month meant that they too thought that civilization would come back. That was Martin's plan, after all. Wait for order to reassert itself and then emerge with all the necessities for securing a place in it. Trade goods, bearer bonds, cash money, and his wits, all backed by a loyal group of followers who knew how to fire every gun in Fort Doom's substantial armory. Civilizations had risen and fallen before. Humanity needed to work together, but hell was other people. When the best people were on top, things worked. They convinced the rational, cajoled the stubborn, and frankly forced the rest. It was for the greater good. Put one of the losers, the takers, at the top of the pile, and they'd lead the rest into catastrophe. One thing had been very clear to Martin through all his life. The takers were steering the ship, and they were going to crash it. Another farm proved to be looted and burned, which was scary. Then they found a town, strangest of strange things. Elfrida even had 2 stores, where the storekeepers ran a ledger on a tablet, keeping track of what everyone took. They'd all agreed that they'd settle up when things were back to normal. Martin was with the group that visited the town after the initial scout out, and he forced himself not to laugh at back to normal. The storekeeper's tablets had lists of things that people in the town needed: medicine, some construction materials, engine parts, controllers, and other components for solar arrays. The tablets listed trade goods from all the people in town. Everything from kitchen garden produce to frozen meat to clothing and female sanitary goods. From his discussions with the storekeepers, Martin learned that there were other little towns like this one, even some bigger places where they were using solar power, local networking, databases on tablets to keep track of who had what and who needed what and who'd taken what. The towns traded a little and kept notes on what was going on, who they'd met, and what to watch out for. What about protection? Martin asked. The shopkeeper, Pakistani or Indian and middle-aged, wearing a clean white button-up shirt and slacks, shrugged. What kind of protection? You know, gangs, militias, that kind of thing. He thought about the word he was looking for. Marauders. The shopkeeper smiled. We don't have that sort of thing, thank goodness. He smiled at Martin. Martin suppressed his disgusted headshake. Give it a month or 2. This guy would be dead, and everything he owned would be in the possession of someone stronger and a hell of a lot less naive. Martin almost wanted to shoot the guy himself. Better a good guy like Martin should get all the guy's trade goods than some marauder. Well, if it ever becomes a problem, we might be able to help you, Martin said. We'll check in every week or two, and you let us know if anyone's bothering you. That was how you started rebuilding, Martin thought, the strong protecting the weak, and the weak giving the strong a tribute and deference. The shopkeeper gave Martin a funny look and said he would, and then traded Martin a bunch of dried mango for some of Martin's powdered milk. There were kids in town, and they drank more than the local cows and goats gave. A radio station started up reportedly in Phoenix, all young people with special guests who came on to talk about the abandoned houses they'd liberated. Some were in neighborhoods where the Fort Doom residents owned property, places where there had been gates and guards and security systems. They all bristled at the thought that their homes might be invaded next. So many terrible things had happened since they took to Fort Doom, but this was what made the event seem real. If the property rights of people like them were slipping away, then everything was up for grabs. The DJs played recorded music and brought on live bands and traded tips about the locations of clinics and hospitals, soup kitchens and daycares. It was surreal. They painted a picture of a radically depopulated Phoenix, full of empty houses, shuttered businesses, cold ashes from violence long past. Phoenix, populated only by the people who couldn't leave. Summer was coming soon, and one DJ interviewed an emergency cooling working group, 6 eager HVAC hackers who were talking through ways to build neighborhood shelters where you could go to get out of the summer heat that was scant months away, plans for evaporative coolers that ran on cheap solar cells, with parts lists and depots where you could go to get or give parts. Through trade and rationing, the residents of Fort Doom had managed to live in relative comfort. But that didn't mean life was easy. Some supplies were running low. Peanut butter, fresh fruit, oatmeal. And the boredom was like a living thing, gnawing away at their extremities from the moment they rolled out of bed to the moment they lay back down. For all the joking about being in solitary together, there was a current of truth underneath it all, manifesting itself in snappish arguments and long sulks, factions, and epic binge-drinking sessions. Jean inventoried the med supplies and discovered that most of their opioid painkillers were gone, and there was a witch hunt over who'd been getting high, but no one was ever conclusively convicted of the pilferage. And there was Phoenix, and the radio broadcasts, and the news from their old neighborhoods, and there was James and Ray, who were simultaneously their best scouts and the biggest troublemakers, demanding to be allowed to go check things out, see how they were going. Georgia decided to go with them. The residents of Fort Doom were about done with the end of the world and ready to go back to massages, steaks, cocktail bars, squash games, hard work, big profits, arguing on social media, ill-advised sex with interesting strangers, all the comforts of modernity. When they left Phoenix, it had been a thriving city filled with TaskRabbits and 7-Elevens, Ubers, and exclusive bespoke suit makers and couture fashion boutiques. Surely some remnant of all that remained. So he greenlit the mission, and they tuned into the DJs all around the clock like it was a radio play about a much more interesting apocalypse than the one they were living through. Warren had a joke. Armageddon tired of waiting around, and he would bust it out all day. At first they groaned, then they chorused it with him, then they tuned it out. But as the days after James and Ray and Georgia left for Phoenix stretched out into a week, and as the DJs on the radio station reported on a wave of sickness that was passing through the city, thought to be Legionella or Listeria, and advised on treating the people without antibiotics, keeping them hydrated and comfortable, they found themselves all making the same stupid joke. Armageddon tired of this shit, they'd say. Armageddon tired too. No one laughed, not even Warren. When the three finally returned 10 days later, they came with a bounty: canned fruit, chocolate, opioids, a stack of graphic novels, and old porno mags from some small-town used bookstore. They traded away gemstones, a little ammo, for a caliber of gun that Martin had decided against keeping in the fort, forgetting to get rid of the loads, and a huge bag of shitty weed. They were greeted as returning heroes and regaled them all with heroic tales of adventures and narrow escapes, describing a phoenix that changed block by block. First, a long burned scar still smelling of smoke, then a perfectly kept neighborhood with rows of porta potties every couple houses, solar shower bags on the roofs, people waving from the roofs, and kids playing in a makeshift daycare under a shade sail on an apartment building lawn. They tried to visit Martin's old complex, where several of them, including Ray, had homes, but someone had fired warning shots over their heads from the guardhouse. They tried shouting to the unseen defenders, but when another volley whizzed over their heads, lower this time, they'd gotten the message and run off. Still, everyone was excited by all the news, the picture of a city picking itself up from its knees, the pockets of normalcy, and Martin was glad that gemstones were still acceptable trade goods. He looked forward to the day when he could get his thumb drives out of his floor safe and start mobilizing his cryptocurrency assets again. Georgia and Martin had a drink in his room that night. After she'd had a hot shower and a whiskey, they'd had an on-again, off-again in the early days of Fort Doom, and apparently it was on again. Martin fell asleep, spooned up to her, face buried in her shampoo-smelling hair, tired, sticky, and deeply satiated. Leadership wasn't easy, but it had its perks. Georgia got sick the next day. Martin woke to her vomiting in his ensuite, groaning between volleys. With trepidation, he peeked into the bathroom, discovering her nude, bent over the toilet, the backs of her legs streaked with watery stools that were pooling around her knees. The smell was incredible. He covered his mouth and nose and backed out and went and got a bucket and filled it with a mild bleach solution. He donned gloves and a mask and broke into a fresh package of kitchen sponges and cleaned up around Georgia, giving her a hair elastic, even sponging the backs of her legs down. He emptied the bucket down the toilet between her spasms and dissolved rehydration salts in distilled water for her. He got her turned around, seated on the toilet, with the empty, bleach-smelling bucket for what remained of the mucousy contents of her gut. She looked like hell and was running a temperature. Martin didn't want to alarm the rest, but he went and got Ray and James and checked in with them to see if they had any symptoms. They all agreed, even Georgia, between spasms, that they should turn Martin's room into an isolation ward and brought in some cots. Jean packed a few boxes of supplies and brought in a mini fridge on a dolly and some of their broad-spectrum antibiotics, including a couple doses in liquid form, along with a hypo or so they could inject Georgia, who was in no shape to take anything orally or even as a suppository. They mixed it with some Dramamine, which knocked her out. Martin instructed the other two to take turns waking her at 20-minute intervals to sip at water and change her bedpan as necessary. James and Ray were sick by the next morning. Martin let them take care of themselves, getting more buckets and a chem toilet so they wouldn't have to compete for the ensuite. Martin had spent the night in one of the empty double rooms. Jean had helped him clear out the supplies and had started wearing one of his few remaining bunny suits to visit the quarantine, checking in on an hourly basis. A pall hung over the fort, everyone speaking in whispers, and the other residents were subtly avoiding Martin, edging away from him when he entered a room. He spent the afternoon outside walking the perimeter, checking the wiring and the solar array and the sensors, repairing some of the crumbling mortar around the shortwave antenna. Normally he liked the solitude, but that day his thoughts ran around and around in a loop that circled from anxiety about whether he was going to get sick to irrational resentment at James, Ray, and Georgia for bringing their pathogens home to Fort Doom, to an even more irrational resentment of the rest of the fort's residents for their obvious suspicion that he was about to get sick too. It was almost a relief when his gut spasmed. Not literally, of course. The pain doubled him up like a kick in the abdomen, and he knew in a flash he'd never make it back to the fort, so he yanked his pants down around his ankles just in time to spare them from the torrent that sprayed out of his ass. Moments later, he began to vomit. Once the first wave had passed, he cleaned himself up with bleach wipes from his day pack and drank some electrolyte, then put the bleach wipes in a baggie and snuck some of his private stash of Cipro, which he'd been carrying around since Georgia first took sick. He joined the other three in their quarantine. James was now too weak to make it to the toilet, which meant that there were 2 bedpans to be emptied. On the other hand, it also meant that there was no competition for the 2 toilets. Martin made it clear to Ray that the ensuite was his. Ray could use the chem toilet. Ray didn't object. He was so weak and feverish he could barely speak. Georgia died on day 8. Her fever so high that she practically sizzled. Martin figured out that she was dead when he went to feed her a teaspoonful of water and found that her hot, dry skin had gone cold and clammy. Jean left a body bag outside the door of Martin's room. Martin had followed several online guides to outfitting the fort, and body bags appeared on all of them. And he and Ray managed to put George's body into it and then change the sheets. James died the next day. Martin couldn't struggle out of bed to help bag him at first, but then he did. And the two bodies were hauled away by healthy survivors. They burned the bodies along with the bags of sheets and clothes that Martin and Ray passed out. Martin started to rally the next day, and then amazingly so did Ray. They lay exhausted in their beds, drinking both broth and electrolyte. Then they took turns in Martin's shower, bundled up their filthy clothes and sheets and changed into clean pajamas, brushed their teeth, shaved. They agreed that they had better spend another day in the quarantine just in case. And then they both decided, fuck that, and went back out amongst the rest, weak and floaty. Martin had lost 10 pounds, and his skin was grayish and loose on his face, but he knew he would live. He was a survivor. The next time it was Saleha, Lloyd, and Izzy. None of them lived. They burned them in the little impromptu graveyard down the hill from Fort Doom in the lee of its rise where it couldn't be seen from the road. They didn't mark the graves, but they noted the GPS coordinates so they could put up stones later when normalcy had been reestablished. It wasn't clear how the infection had come back to Fort Doom, or even if it was the same infection. The septic tanks were full, though, and they'd had to switch to chem toilets and empty them into a pit they'd excavated for the purpose, noisome and a swarm with flies. Martin spoke over the grave, summoning his best words. There had been an interruption in the radio programming from Phoenix, lasting for a long month while infection burned through the city, but it was back on the air, with news about antibiotic supplies that were being manufactured in a reclaimed factory in Chandler. The original DJs were off the air, and there was a memorial program for them. By Christmas, things had settled into a routine. There wasn't so much to be bored any longer, at least between hunting and careful trading forays and digging new latrine pits. The residents of Fort Doom had their hands full. It would have been much worse if the farms of Elfrida hadn't had such a lucky good year. A bountiful harvest they traded with Fort Doom for more gems, and when those ran out, humiliating and backbreaking stints picking in the fields. Martin drew the line at this and discouraged the others in the fort from it, but they didn't all listen to him. Pickers got paid in fruit. Everyone else just got root vegetables, the only thing the farmers were willing to trade. Sarah picked for 2 weeks straight, coming back lean and brown and muscled, and conspicuously complaining about the fact that Fort Doom didn't afford them any opportunities for agriculture. Martin tried to shut her down by talking about the intrinsically vulnerable circumstances of farming, and she countered by snappishly reminding them that all of the vulnerability of fucking starving to death. No more boredom in Fort Doom then, but still, plenty of tension. Martin decided that they needed to throw a party. Thanksgiving had come and gone unobserved, but they could still celebrate the extraordinary circumstances of their survival of the event by trimming a tree, cooking a feast, exchanging small gifts. Martin had packed a plastic tree in the fort supply, thinking of how much fun it would be to surprise his guests on their first Christmas together. It had come as a package with candy canes and tinsel and ornaments. He awoke early on December 19th to assemble the tree in the hospitality suite, taking the opportunity to bag up the drifts of litter and sweep up the tracked-in dirt. When he was done, he stepped back and surveyed the room, expecting it to look festive and cheerful, but it looked sad and desperate. The plastic tree and its twinkling strings of LEDs, small and artificial, the room still grimy, the sofa cushions stained and threadbare. For the millionth time, he wished that the fucking crisis would end. Armageddon tired of this shit. Which made him remember that Warren was dead, in a bag in an unmarked grave in the lee of the ridge. Sarah was the first one awake after Martin put up the tree, and she rolled her eyes at it, and said she'd have been invited to Christmas dinner with the other farmhands who'd picked that fall. But she helped make the name slips for the Secret Santa and rearranged the tinsel and ornaments to good effect. Martin deliberately left the decorations clumped together to give other people something to fix, which was the most surefire way to create a sense of ownership over the project. The kitchen still had a good supply of spices, and Martin had deliberately stashed 3 cases of cooking wine, and he asked Sarah to see if he could figure out a decent mulled wine recipe with the materials at hand, and that got everyone kibitzing. And then Fort Doom was filled with delicious smells and day drinking and wobbly good cheer. That was lunchtime. By dinner time, though, they had cheap wine hangovers, and the black dog stalked them, reminding them of the family members they'd left behind at the event, of the dead from Fort Doom, of the chaos outside the armored door. Dinner was somber and quick, and no one wanted to hang around the hospitality suite after. Gene hatched a plan to liven up some of their MREs and make a real feast out of the Christmas dinner, adding fresh ingredients and salted venison, plating everything with care, using real table linens, and setting out candles. Martin gave the plan his blessing and went back to work on his secret Santa gift, a leather cigar case with two of his dwindling store of cohibas for Seth, one for him and one for a friend. Smoking cigars on the ridge while the sun set over the desert was one of the true pleasures of the end of the world. Finally, on the 24th, with one day until the party, the mood shifted. The idea of a Christmas spirit was stupid and sentimental, but that didn't make it any less real. They had it. Everyone was hiding in their own private spaces, making gifts, and when they weren't doing that, they were making paper snowflakes or cutting up clothes from the rag bag to make party outfits. Someone put a sprig of paper mistletoe over the doorway between the galley and the hospitality suite, and they made a game of ambushing each other and kissing on the cheek. This game was considerably enlivened by the now perpetual pot of cheap spiced wine. Sarah made her great-grandmother's depression cookies, which were flourless and used powdered egg and powdered milk and still smelled and looked great in the oven. They were decorated with icing and set on a conspicuous serving tray in the kitchen with a "Do not eat, this means you" sign. And they all stopped by to admire them and dare each other to violate the sign. It was the most fun they'd had in weeks, and the best mood they'd felt in months. And Martin kept peeking in on them, reassuring himself that his plan was working, that he was the leader he thought he was. The day after Christmas, they lolled around the hospitality suite in their pajamas, still full from the feast from the night before. Seth stepped outside to enjoy one of his cigars and came back in, rosy-cheeked, radiating cold, and smelling of good, mellow Cuban tobacco. They had hangovers, of course, fierce headaches that made them want to talk in low voices. As he sweated and grew a little nauseated, Martin wished he hadn't drunk so much mulled wine the night before, but comforted himself by recalling that they'd gotten through the entire supply of cheap wine and wouldn't be tempted for a repeat. Seth was the first to start vomiting. It came on suddenly, too quickly for him to reach the toilet, and he left streaks on the floor all the way to the bathroom. Awful smelling and all pervasive. When Martin stood to get the gloves and bleach wipes, his head swam, and he realized that he didn't just have a headache. He had a fever. He gingerly cleaned up the mess, then got the ear thermometer. It read 103 degrees. They were all sick. Maybe it was whatever had almost killed Martin the last time. Maybe it was something new. Fort Doom was out of antibiotics. By New Year's, 8 of the remaining 12 had died. The rest were too weak to bury them, though they did manage to drag their bodies out the front door. Fort Doom was a charnel house. The septic tank had backed up again, so even when the survivors could muster the strength to get to the toilet, it wouldn't flush. The chem toilets overflowed. They filled buckets, then knocked the buckets over as they reeled around with fever, fetching water and rehydration salts and headache pills. Martin's fever spiked to 107, and then he slept for a long time, waking only when his gut spasmed and tried to wring out whatever was left in them. When his fever broke on January 4, he discovered he was the last person alive in Fort Doom. Martin nursed himself back to health, crawling at first, then staggering around, drinking high-calorie meal replacement powders and bouillon cubes and lukewarm water. He dragged the smaller bodies outside, rested a day and a night, then did the larger bodies. He cleaned. Days went past, and his fever returned and receded. The power failed, and he got the backup generator working. He checked the CCTV cameras and thought about leaving, and thought about where he could go. He was too weak to get far, and he'd be helpless. Now that he was running on generator power, he had to conserve his propane stores, so he stopped boiling his water before drinking it. Now he dripped iodine into it and sucked it through a life straw and hoped that would be enough. The overflowing septic pits made him leery of drinking any more of the fort's well water without treating it. He didn't know why the sickness had burned through Fort Doom, but that was his top suspect. Then, one day, the fever came back, and sat on him, burning him up, refusing to budge. His joints ached. So sick she thought she was dying. She learned first aid and basic sanitation and the kind of food hygiene you used in a pandemic. She'd learned the word pandemic. She learned to assay the antibiotics coming off the little production line they'd built as part of the quality assurance process. She'd learned to take direction from the tech leads on the big water filtration plant they brought back online. She'd learned to read topographical maps. And she'd learned to lead the teams that sought out the sick to offer them aid. She learned that she liked doing these things. She'd learned that rebuilding, caring, and fixing kept the sudden terrors and the creeping tears away. She'd learned that while nothing would ever bring back her sons, her husband, her nephew Albert, that the memory of the people she'd helped nurse from the brink of death would soften the sorrow she felt when she thought of her own dead. She'd kept count. One helped for each she'd lost, then 2, then 5 alive for each of her dead. She'd stopped counting. There were 2 children who lived with her now. No one knew where their parents were. Lene was 6 and Darnell was 9. When they smiled, it was like all her dead were smiling on her. The man who'd left her to die had left his door open. She knew he had guns. They all had guns out here. She was pretty sure one of her guys was carrying, even though none of them were supposed to carry, thinking of the way that the man had talked to her, had talked to Albert, had fired on them. She was secretly glad that they had a gun, too. Sir? Hello? She had smelled these smells before, but they didn't get easier to take. Shit, sickness, rotting garbage, dead people. One of the men came back from around the rear of the entrance to the bunker with vomit down the front of his own shirt. So many dead back there. She made sure her mask was in place and smeared some vapor rub under her nose. Sir, she took a tentative step into the vestibule. Over the mounds of trash bags, some torn open by animals, she was glad the bodies were hidden from her view. It was natural what animals did to human remains, but it could be hard to take. They took so long to leave. Martin bit down on his belt when the spasms hit, not making so much as a whimper. His panic room was little bigger than a coffin, just a crawl space beneath the garage, filled with old gas fumes. He had a charged phone, though, and the local Wi-Fi, and could watch as they searched the fort, watch outside as they built a pyre and burned the dead. They took so long. He whimpered into the leather of his belt. But they left, eventually. By then, he was too weak to move the heavy plate over his head. He pushed it as hard as he could, so hard he lost control of his anal sphincter and felt hot shit squirt down his leg. He pushed harder, panic rising in him. The fever ground at his joints. Finally, he closed his eyes. He'd take a nap and try again. He'd regain his strength after a nap. Ha! And there you go. That's Cory Doctorow, Radicalized, the Masque of the Red Death. So that's what you get when you fuck off from society to your own fortress of solitude, your silo of Ayn Randian excellence. You don't learn anything, and you have no idea what it is that you're doing, and you don't bring people on to help you do better than what you are. So I thought that's a great story to read right now. I enjoy doing this. I hope that you guys enjoy listening. I'll probably come back and read something else. I'm looking around my library now to see any likely titles, but I'm not sure what I'll read next. But I think I'll be back tomorrow night. So until then, I'm gonna pose with the pipe for a second. How? I'll just like this. I'll just shit like this. That's a good pose, right? It's a good pose. Anyways. All right, guys. Until tomorrow night.